The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly under the rising sun, a canvas of shimmering gold hiding the dark truth beneath it. In 1941, Japanese commanders believed they understood every enemy they would face in the coming war. They believed in their superiority, spiritual, physical, and tactical. Their soldiers had marched across Asia, crushed armies far larger than their own, and forged a reputation as the most disciplined, most fearless warriors on earth. Americans, they thought, were industrial fighters, not real fighters. Soft, slow, dependent on machines, unprepared for the raw brutality Japan's forces would unleash. But they were wrong. And the first signs of this truth would hit them like a shockwave. B-roll slow pan over calm ocean. Imperial Japanese Navy ships cutting across the water. Even before Pearl Harbor, Japanese military intelligence had studied the U.S. Marines. Their reports were dismissive. The Marines, Tokyo claimed, were a small expeditionary force with experience in minor colonial conflicts, banana wars, small landings, policing actions, nothing that could prepare them for the savage, hand-to-hand, night-fighting hell the Japanese army specialized in. And so, when Japan launched its lightning offensive across the Pacific, they expected the Marines to fold just like every other force they had crushed. But on December 8, 1941, just one day after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese assault on Wake Island delivered the first crack in that illusion. Wake Island. The first shock. Japanese forces launched bombing raids expecting a quick victory, but the Marines on Wake, vastly outnumbered and armed with almost nothing, met the attackers with a level of precision and calm that stunned the Japanese aircrews. Their anti-aircraft guns fired with surgical accuracy. Their aircraft, the outdated F-4F Wildcats, fought Japanese Zeros and actually won duels in the air. Japanese pilots returned to their carriers shaken, reporting an intensity they did not expect. On December 11th, the Japanese Navy attempted a landing. It was supposed to be easy. Instead, it turned into disaster. Marines destroyed a destroyer, damaged other ships, and forced the invasion force to retreat, the only time in World War II that a Japanese amphibious landing was driven back. B-roll, archival footage of Wake Island, burning ships, Marines firing beach guns. One Japanese officer reportedly muttered, "These are not ordinary Americans." But the high command dismissed it. Wake was an exception. They said a lucky day for the enemy. They had no idea what awaited them on Guadalcanal, where the illusion broke in August 1942. When Marines stormed Guadalcanal, Japanese commanders thought they could simply counterattack and throw them back into the sea. They believed their night fighting skills, their bayonet charges, and their fearless human wave tactics would crush the inexperienced Americans. But within days, Japanese patrols began sending back disturbing reports. The Marines were not collapsing, they were not panicking, they were not afraid of the jungle. Instead, they were adapting fast. Japanese units found Marine patrols moving through the jungle silently, tactically, like predators. Marines conducted coordinated ambushes, fire and maneuver attacks, and displayed marksmanship that Japanese soldiers described as uncomfortably accurate. One Marine sniper could pin down an entire Japanese platoon for hours. Their machine gun teams worked like clockwork. When Japanese forces attempted to infiltrate at night, they ran into Marines who waited calmly in darkness, listening, sensing, firing only when absolutely certain. The Japanese had expected weakness, but they found steel. B-roll, dense jungle shots. Marines moving through Guadalcanal terrain. Maps, firefights, the Ichiki disaster. A turning point in Japanese thinking. Colonel Kiyono, Ichiki, commanding one of Japan's toughest elite units, landed on Guadalcanal with around 900 men, the finest Japan could send. He believed American morale was broken. He believed his men would sweep the Marines aside in one swift, glorious charge. On the night of August 21st, Ichiki launched a frontal assault on the Marine perimeter at Alligator Creek. The Marines were ready. They held their fire until the perfect moment. Machine guns opened up with devastating precision. Mortar rained down with mathematical timing. Riflemen fired so fast and so accurately that Japanese officers thought that Americans had triple their real numbers. Ichiki's battalion was destroyed almost completely. The Japanese high command refused to believe the initial reports. They accused surviving officers of exaggerating or but the truth was undeniable. An elite Japanese force had been annihilated by a supposedly inferior American unit. When Japanese commanders studied the aftermath, what disturbed them most was not American firepower, it was American discipline. Their defensive positions were expertly built. Their teamwork was flawless. Their officers were calm under pressure. Their junior sergeants made independent decisions, something unthinkable in Japan's rigid hierarchy. One Japanese survivor wrote, "Their guns speak with one voice." Another commented, "Their bullets find us even in darkness." The growing respect and fear as months passed, Guadalcanal turned into a grinding nightmare for Japanese forces. They expected Marines to break from disease, hunger, and exhaustion. Instead, they found fighters who adapted to every hardship, who built better defenses than expected, who executed counterattacks with terrifying focus. General Kawaguchi, who fought the Marines on the island, made a statement that echoed through the Japanese command structure. "We underestimated these men. These are not the Americans of our old stories." Reports spread. Marine fire is extremely accurate. Their spirit does not break. Their junior leaders command like officers. Among the Americans, the Marines are the strongest. The Japanese high command could no longer deny it. They had not encountered a soft, inexperienced foreign force. They had encountered a hardened, disciplined warrior elite. And on the killing fields of Guadalcanal, Japan learned a truth that would haunt its commanders for the rest of the war. The U.S. Marines were not just soldiers. They were a force built for the kind of war Japan thought only it could win. Before Japan ever met the U.S. Marines in open, decisive combat, a long chain of beliefs, traditions, military doctrines, and cultural assumptions shaped what Japanese commanders thought about American fighting men, and why the shock of facing the Marines hit them so hard. Decades before the Pacific War erupted, Japan had forged a military identity built on sacrifice, obedience, and absolute spiritual commitment. The Imperial Japanese Army believed deeply in Bushido, a warrior ethic that glorified death before surrender, endurance over comfort, and blind loyalty over individual initiative. Their training was brutal. Soldiers endured beatings, starvation exercises, forced marches, bayonet drills where hesitation was punished, and field conditions that tested them far beyond normal human limits. Officers believed hardship created strength and that technological dependence made a soldier weak. So when their intelligence analysts reviewed American forces in the 1930s, they assumed the United States military, especially a small branch like the Marine Corps, could never match Japan's battlefield resilience. Reports suggested Americans were material soldiers, highly equipped, mechanically supported, and effective only when their technology functioned. In Japan's eyes, Americans lacked the spiritual toughness to survive sustained jungle warfare, night infiltration, or close-range combat. The Marines, despite their reputation in small interventions like Nicaragua or Haiti, were dismissed as a policing force, not a serious battlefield opponent. Japanese commanders believed a large industrial nation could never produce warriors with real combat spirit. During Japan's campaigns in China and Manchuria, this confidence solidified even further. Japanese units fought ferocious battles, often against larger forces, and came out victorious again and again. The victory over Russia in 1905, the rapid conquest of Manchuria in 1931, and the sweeping offensives in China in 1937 convinced Tokyo that no Western army could withstand the imperial military's aggressiveness. They believed their soldiers possessed a unique fighting soul unmatched anywhere else. Discipline within the Japanese ranks came from a rigid hierarchy where junior soldiers obeyed without question. Leadership flowed from the top down with no tolerance for improvisation. This structure worked well in environments Japan controlled, especially in Asia. What Japanese commanders did not realize was that this same rigidity would become a weakness against a flexible, initiative-driven force like the U.S. Marine Corps. On the American side, the Marine Corps developed its identity through entirely different circumstances. While Japan built a land army for domination on the Asian continent, the Marines evolved into a specialized amphibious assault force, designed for expeditionary warfare. During the Banana Wars in the Caribbean and Central America, Marines refined small unit tactics, jungle fighting skills, rapid deployment methods, and an intense marksmanship program that made every Marine a deadly rifleman. They lived by the creed that every Marine must be able to take initiative, lead under pressure, and operate independently, even with poor communication. In contrast to Japanese training that stressed obedience, the Marines emphasized decision-making and adaptability. Their doctrine of every Marine a rifleman produced a culture where even cooks and clerks received full combat training. Marine NCOs held far more authority than their Japanese equivalents, a difference that would shock Japanese commanders on Guadalcanal. When they saw sergeants directing combat with the discipline of officers, this difference meant that when chaos hit the battlefield, as it always did in the Pacific, the Marines responded faster, coordinated better, and adapted sooner. Another major factor shaping Japanese expectations was their view of American culture. Japanese propaganda portrayed the United States as a soft, wealthy nation whose people lived in comfort and avoided hardship. The belief was that Americans lacked the desire to fight long wars or endure brutal conditions. Japanese officers saw Hollywood films showing American luxury and assumed it reflected their military's character. This cultural blindness made Japan severely underestimate the harsh discipline of Marine training, forced marches, cold water conditioning, bayonet drills, obstacle courses, and relentless discipline that forged Marines into some of the most physically and mentally resilient troops in the world. Japan also misunderstood how industrial strength could serve combat effectiveness. They saw reliance on machines as a weakness. The US saw it as an advantage. Marines became masters of coordinated firepower rifles, machine guns, mortar combined with the support of naval guns, aircraft, and logistics unmatched by Japan. This integration of technology and discipline created a force far deadlier than Japan expected. Japan's belief in quick war also influenced their entire Pacific strategy depended on rapid, overwhelming victories that would demoralize the United States. Japanese commanders believed the US lacked the national will to fight a long, bloody island war. They assumed that if America suffered early losses, it would seek peace or retreat from the Pacific. This belief blinded them to the Marine Corps culture of resilience and deep camaraderie, the kind of brotherhood that made Marines fight not just for country, but for each other. The Japanese military also misread the political structure of the US, unlike Japan, where military leaders held unchecked authority. America's military drew strength from a united industrial, economic, and democratic system. Marines fought knowing reinforcements and supplies would come. Japanese soldiers fought increasingly alone, cut off, starving, and outnumbered. Logistics played another huge role. Japan did not understand how effectively Marines could build defensive positions, transport equipment, and establish supply lines under pressure. The Japanese army believed jungle terrain would cripple American forces. But Marine engineers, supported by Navy Seabees, turned jungles into fortified bases, airfields, and supply hubs. They built faster than Japan could destroy. This shocked Japanese commanders on Guadalcanal, who assumed American logistics would collapse before their own. Instead, Japanese soldiers starved while Marines dug deeper, fortified stronger, and fought harder. Finally, Japanese commanders lacked accurate intelligence. Their reconnaissance underestimated American troop numbers, morale, defensive preparations, and ability to reinforce islands quickly. They believed Americans would break after a single night attack or human wave, assault tactics that had worked against Chinese forces. What they did not understand was that Marines responded to shock attacks with discipline, communication, and deadly accuracy. By the time Japan realized their assumptions were wrong, it was too late. The US Marines were no longer just a force Japan underestimated. They had become the enemy Japan feared the most. They had expected a rout, but what Japanese commanders witnessed instead reshaped their understanding of the Pacific War forever. As the sun rose over the shattered coral ridges of Guadalcanal, the imperial officers' men like Major General Kyoto Kawaguchi, Colonel Ichiki's surviving staff officers, and the battle-hardened Marines of the 2nd Imperial Combined Brigade found themselves staring at an enemy unlike anything they had trained for. This was not the untested, inexperienced American force the propaganda had promised. These were Marines who fought with a kind of primal, relentless, almost animalistic determination that contradicted every assumption Tokyo had made in its war planning. Reports coming from the front were chaotic, panicked, and full of contradictions. One officer wrote, "They attack as though they do not fear death," while another warned, "Their fire discipline is perfect, their accuracy terrifying, their courage is monstrous." And as the Japanese lines collapsed in the dense jungles around the Matanaku River, commanders began to understand that the Marines possessed something that training could not simulate: adaptability. Whether ambushed, cut off, soaked in days of rain, or reduced to half rations, they continued pushing forward with an aggression that stunned even veteran Japanese troops. B-roll, dark jungle, silhouettes of Marines moving, Japanese commanders studying maps under lantern light. The turning point came not from a large battle, but a series of small, brutal skirmishes that Japanese commanders later described as nails sealing the coffin of our assumptions. Patrols expected to ambush small Marine units instead ran into fire teams that moved like ghosts, fast, coordinated, and frighteningly accurate. A Japanese lieutenant remembered watching a Marine squad crawl through brush with the precision of hunters. Their helmets were low, their rifles steady, and not one wasted a movement. Another commander reported that Marines rotated positions flawlessly, always covering each other, always communicating through hand signals. While Japanese units often relied on loud verbal orders that exposed their positions, even the Japanese machine gunners, some of the best in the world, found themselves outmatched by the blistering rate of American BARs and M1919s, pouring fire with surgical timing, and when the Marines counterattacked, it was explosive. They didn't push, they slammed into positions like a tidal wave. Visual cue, explosions, Marines charging. Japanese officers stunned by the time the fighting reached its bloodiest stage. Japanese commanders were openly admitting that their intelligence on the Americans had been catastrophically wrong. Instead of soft, lazy, undisciplined Westerners, they found themselves facing athletes, hunters, and farm boys built like oxen, conditioned for endurance by childhood labor, and trained in amphibious warfare with a rigor unmatched by any other Allied force. Their aim shocked the Japanese. Marines did not fire blindly. They fired once, accurately, killing with single rounds. Japanese troops trained for bayonet charges and close combat shock tactics found themselves shredded before they could get within stabbing range. Kawaguchi later wrote, "Their snipers were demons. They killed silently, with perfect patience." Meanwhile, on other islands, Tarawa, Saipan, New Britain, Cape Gloucester, the pattern repeated. Every time Japanese commanders underestimated the Marines, they paid in blood. During one engagement, a Japanese officer observing through binoculars muttered, "They fight like wild beasts," not as an insult but as a warning. Another officer reported that Marines had a terrifying ability to rise again after being knocked back, even when exhausted, half-starved, and surrounded. They regrouped with iron discipline and launched counterattacks that felt supernatural in their intensity. B-roll, Marines pushing through smoke and rubble. The Japanese also noted something they had never expected. The American way of war was not individual bravery alone. It was overwhelming coordination. Naval gunfire, artillery, tanks, engineers, and infantry all moved like parts of a single living organism. Marines pinned the Japanese down. Destroyers offshore blasted bunkers. Aircraft strafed supply routes. Tanks rolled forward in synchronization. One Japanese major called it a perfectly timed hammer striking with 20 arms. And yet, it wasn't just power, it was mentality. Japanese commanders were stunned at how Marines joked during battle, cursed loudly, pushed through fear with humor, and encouraged one another constantly. This psychological resilience baffled them. "They laugh even while dying," one officer wrote, "and this makes them impossible to intimidate." The myth that Americans were soft evaporated entirely after battles where Marines held positions against impossible odds, refusing to retreat even when surrounded. Japanese night assault units, elite shock troops trained to infiltrate and slaughter. Sleeping enemies were horrified to find Marines waiting for them, awake, alert, and absolutely ruthless in close quarters. Instead of panicking, Marines formed tight defensive circles, firing calmly into the darkness while NCOs barked sharp orders. Japanese commanders finally realized something unsettling. Unlike many armies, the U.S. Marines were not dependent on their officers. If every officer died, the NCOs took command. If the NCOs died, privates stepped up. Every Marine was trained to think, improvise, and take initiative. This terrified the Japanese, whose own rank structure relied heavily on obedience and top-down control. B-roll, Marine squad fighting independently. Japanese officers whispering in disbelief by the midpoint of the war. Japanese field reports openly warned Tokyo that Marine units were the most tenacious enemy we have encountered, and that their combination of firepower, physical strength, discipline, and sheer stubbornness made them extraordinarily dangerous. One commander wrote a message so blunt that it was censored before reaching the emperor: "To defeat the Marines, we must kill every last one. Otherwise, they will come back." But perhaps the most shocking realization came after interrogating captured Marines. Japanese officers were stunned to discover that many were not regular soldiers, they were mechanics, farmers, truck drivers, athletes, fishermen, college boys, but all shared the same unwavering confidence that America would win the war. That belief, that absolute certainty, created a spirit the Japanese could not break. And so, as reports piled up across every island chain, a single uncomfortable truth echoed through Japanese command circles. The Americans they had mocked at the beginning of the war were gone. In their place stood the United States Marines, an unstoppable force that refused to die, refused to break, and refused to retreat. What Japanese commanders thought they understood about the U.S. Marines' bravery? tenacity, marksmanship was only the beginning. The real shock came when they discovered the one advantage that completely shattered Japan's war doctrine. The Marines learned faster than any enemy they had ever faced. At first, Japanese strategy relied on the belief that their early war dominance in jungle fighting, night assaults, and close-quarter ambushes would permanently keep American forces off balance. But somewhere in the thick, mosquito-ridden jungles of the Solomon Islands, Japanese commanders began noticing something terrifying. Tactics that were once uniquely Japanese were now being used against them, improved, sharpened, and executed with machine-like precision. Night fighting, once the pride of the Imperial Army, no longer guaranteed success. Marines, after suffering brutal nighttime casualties, adapted within weeks. They built spider-trap defensive circles, set overlapping machine gun arcs, placed tripflers, and used grenades like clockwork. Japanese shock troops who once slipped through American lines like shadows now found themselves shredded by prepared fire. One stunned Japanese captain wrote, "They steal our tactics, improve them, and return them to us covered in our blood." B-roll, Marines planting Japanese soldiers approaching cautiously. Then came the revelation that changed the psychological balance of the war. The Marines fought smarter, not just harder. Japanese commanders were astonished to see American units map the jungle, mark sniper nests, record ambush patterns, and adjust their formations with mathematical efficiency. No other enemy had ever adapted to Japanese island warfare with such ruthless speed. A staff officer on Bougainville reported in disbelief that a Marine battalion reorganized its entire defensive layout within 12 hours after reviewing captured Japanese documents. He wrote, "This speed is unnatural. They fight us at dawn, and by dusk they fight us differently." Even the feared banzai charges, once a shock tactic that crushed Chinese, British, and early American positions, lost their power. Marines learned to brace for them, holding fire until the last possible second, then unleashing a synchronized wall of bullets, grenades, and mortar that turned entire battalions into tragic, futile sacrifices. Japanese soldiers who survived described the horror of charging into coordinated kill zones, where every Marine, from riflemen to machine gunners, fired with icy discipline. Commanders who once celebrated the spiritual power of banzai attacks now admitted that they were suicidal against the Marines' cold analytical response. One officer wrote bluntly, "Their firepower freezes the soul." B-roll, silhouettes of charging troops, heavy gunfire flashing in darkness. But what truly unnerved Japanese leadership was the discovery of the Marines' logistical and mechanical mastery. The Japanese could fight fiercely but struggled to supply themselves. Meanwhile, the Marines moved artillery through swamps, built airfields from scratch, and repaired tanks under fire. Japanese commanders were stunned as U.S. engineers worked with superhuman efficiency. An airfield destroyed at dawn could be operational by evening. A bridge blown apart by Japanese saboteurs was rebuilt overnight. Supplies flowed like rivers, ammunition never ran out, and wounded Marines were evacuated with astonishing speed. One Japanese colonel confessed, "Their machines fight with them. Their engineers fight with them. Their ships fight with them. It is as though their entire nation is on the battlefield." And then came the worst twist of all. Marine resilience wasn't just physical, it was cultural. Japanese commanders had trained, believing their soldiers possessed unmatched spiritual strength, devotion to the emperor, willingness to die, endurance beyond human limits. But the Marines possessed a different kind of spirit, rooted, not in obedience, but in brotherhood. Japanese officers observed with disbelief how Marines risked their lives to save wounded comrades, how they dragged each other through mud, how they refused to abandon even a single man. This created a unity Tokyo could never replicate. A Japanese intelligence report from 1943 stated, "Their loyalty to each other surpasses our loyalty to the emperor." B-roll, Marines carrying wounded through rain, Japanese officers watching silently, and yet, the twist cut even deeper. Japanese commanders realized that the Marines were not alone. They were backed by an industrial giant Japan could not comprehend. Every Marine killed was replaced by two more. Every rifle lost was replaced by a better one. Every landing came with more ships, more planes, more firepower, like a tide that could not be stopped. The imperial staff described it as fighting a nation that grows stronger while we grow weaker. But the most painful realization, the Marines were becoming experts in the very terrain Japan prided itself on mastering. Jungle warfare was supposed to be Japan's unmatched strength, but by 1944, Japanese commanders watched in disbelief as Marines navigated overgrown ridges, swamps, and volcanic cliffs with expertise rivaling and, eventually surpassing their own. They used camouflage, deception, counter-ambushes, and reconnaissance patrols that moved with deadly silence. Japanese soldiers described the terrifying moment. They realized the Marines could smell danger the same way Japanese scouts could. One surviving officer on Peleliu wrote, "The jungle has shifted loyalty. It favors them now." The final twist came in the form of radio intercepts and diary entries recovered from fallen Marines' youth that the Americans did not view themselves as superior warriors, did not expect easy victory, and trained constantly to overcome their flaws. The Japanese were horrified to discover that Marines relentlessly critiqued their own performance. They were unsatisfied even after victories. They demanded to fight harder, shoot better, move faster. They fear their own standards more than they fear us, a captured Japanese observer noted. B-roll Marines training intensely between battles in that moment. Japanese commanders realized the truth they had never imagined at the war's beginning. Their greatest enemy was not Marine strength, it was Marine improvement. The longer the war continued, the stronger the Marines became. The more Japan fought them, the more Japan taught them. And by the time the Imperial High Command fully understood what they were facing, it was too late. The unstoppable force that Japan had unintentionally forged through battle, blood, hardship, and underestimation was now coming for every island, every stronghold, every last remnant of the Empire's Pacific dream. And Japanese commanders, once confident in victory, could now only whisper the words they once would have considered impossible. The Marines have surpassed us? As the war dragged on, Japanese commanders faced a bitter truth. The Marines were not just soldiers, they were a force that defied every calculation, every assumption, and every expectation Japan had held since the first shot of the Pacific War. By 1944, after months of brutal combat on islands from Guadalcanal to Peleliu, the Japanese realized that the Marines' combination of discipline, adaptability, and sheer determination had irrevocably shifted the balance of power. No matter how many elite units Japan threw at them, the Marines absorbed, learned, and evolved faster than the enemy could anticipate. Officers recorded in their diaries how Marine units would arrive on a contested ridge, under heavy fire, and within hours have fortified positions, laid mines, prepared overlapping fields of fire, and coordinated artillery and air support as if orchestrating a symphony of destruction. The speed and efficiency of their adaptation was staggering. And Japanese commanders admitted that the U.S. military's logistical and industrial advantage made this evolution almost unstoppable. The Marines were not fighting alone. Every squad, every platoon, every battalion had the weight of an entire nation's resources at its back. Weapons, ammunition, reinforcements, and medical support flowed consistently, allowing Marines to endure and counter even the harshest conditions. Japanese soldiers watched in horror as their carefully laid ambushes failed repeatedly, not because of poor planning, but because the Americans had already adapted, often before the ambush could be sprung. One Imperial officer wrote with disbelief, "We lay traps as we always have. They walk through them as if they had known them all along. They do not panic. They do not hesitate. They do not fear." B-roll, jungle ambushes, Marines countering attacks, Japanese units retreating. The psychological toll on Japanese troops was equally devastating. They had been trained to believe that courage, spiritual fortitude, and adherence to hierarchy would allow them to overwhelm weaker enemies. But the Marines proved that flexibility, initiative, and camaraderie were just as lethal as fanaticism. Japanese officers reported seeing Marines save wounded comrades under fire, regroup after losses, and execute coordinated attacks even when surrounded. The loyalty within the Marine units was a force multiplier, creating a morale so unbreakable that it seemed almost supernatural. The more Japan attacked, the more the Marines adapted. The more they suffered, the stronger they became. By mid-1944, Japanese field reports included phrases like, "They are impossible to defeat in our standard manner, and every encounter teaches them. Every loss strengthens them." Even the famed Japanese strategy of attrition, the belief that American resolve would eventually crumble under isolation, disease, and exhaustion failed utterly. The Marines thrived in conditions designed to break lesser armies. Heat, disease, swamp, mud, and relentless Japanese attacks were insufficient to shake their determination. And every time they fell back in formation, with fire discipline intact, reorganizing to strike back with even greater precision. B-roll, Marines digging trenches, setting up defensive positions. Night patrols. Japanese commanders also noted a terrifying secondary effect. The Marines were turning Japan's own tactics against them. Night attacks, infiltration strategies, and deception techniques once considered uniquely Japanese were mastered and improved upon by the Americans.